Okay, so welcome to part 2 of the video. So where we left off, we had just done a setup for a production quality rendering. So once you've let that guy run, you should end up with something that looks something like this. And then I can go ahead and click the little save icon at the top here. Let's see, sometimes it's weird. Okay, there we go. And then what we want to do is save it under Save As Type. We want to save it as a PNG, or a portable networks graphic. And what that will do is it'll save it in a way that there's no background. Like this area where the sky is, we won't have any background image there. So let's see, I'm just going to make sure that's saved. Okay, and then when that's done, we can close this frame buffer and everything else. And what I want to do next is make my line drawing. So I also added a little bit of furniture in here. I'm just going to include that in the line drawing. You could also, if you wanted, I think some of you probably have like context modeled and stuff like that. You can include that as well, the street and sidewalk and so on. But I'm gonna Photoshop a lot of that stuff in as well. So let's just go ahead and go to our named views. Go back to section perspective, and I'm going to use the command make 2D. Again, I'll use the command select visible and drag a window select everything I can see in my view. I'm actually going to deselect that line back there. I don't need that, just the ground plane. And press enter. Again, I want to make sure I have maintain source layers checked and clipping plane intersections checked. Click OK. And then over here in top view, okay, there's our drawing. So in the layers panel, again, we have all these layers that were just produced from our make 2D. What I'm going to do, we should have two sub layers basically. We have one that says curves. So if I turn that off, we have the one that says clipping plane intersections. And of course, what that means, it's all the geometry that's being clipped that's intersecting with the clipping plane. So I'm just going to go ahead and make my Poche layers in Rhino here, just because that's easier. I'm going to clean up the Linework just a little bit, and then we'll take it back. We'll take it out into Illustrator. So I'm going to turn off that curves layer. With this layer, I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of these lines. Actually, before I do that, I want to make an offset of this. Give it some thickness. Use the same distance as whatever this is. Okay. I'm going to make a copy of this. And I'll show you a little trick. If we hatch this, use the command hatch without anything selected. If I set that option boundary to yes, and then press enter, select the curves, press enter, and then click somewhere outside, it'll automatically fill all the areas it finds that are closed curves. I'm actually going to just make sure these are closed too. Is that one closed? Okay, so I'm going to select all these lines again, hatch, and if we just click somewhere outside of it, it'll fill all the areas it finds to form closed outlines. And I'm going to go in here and unfill the area where my kind of enclosed volume is, and then I'll press enter. Actually, I'm not sure why we're not seeing a line there where that glass wall is, but anyway. Then I'm going to choose the option solid, click OK. And what I can do with the hatch now, I'll just go select hatch. I'm going to move this guy up on its own. And if I explode this hatch, it'll actually turn back into a surface, which is great. Because then, if we use dupe order, then we get lines that just form the outlines there. We don't see like any of the stuff that's inside in between or whatever. Which we don't need to see. So also just wondering, okay, do I have so I'm not sure why that didn't produce a line there for us, but I'll just make one in here. Okay, great. Delete my hatches here. All right, and then I'll turn the rest of the lines back on. And you can put, I mean, we're only going to use like basically 2 line weights for this. It doesn't matter a whole lot because we're just overlaying it on a rendering. We're not going to spend a ton of time trying to line weight this. We're just going to take these 2 separate kind of layers of information. And I'll select both the sets of lines here, go to File, Export Selected, call this my section, save it, and under Scale, oh yeah, I forgot one thing. We also want to ensure that, so because this is a perspective image, it isn't necessarily to scale. But because we lined up our camera with the clipping plane really precisely there, what we can do is we can take this dimension, so I'll just use the plane distance, from like one end of the site to the other. 46 feet, okay. And so if we just scale our drawing to that dimension, 6, here you go, see it's a little different. So now it should be the correct scale. All right, and then I can go File, Export Selected, Section, Overwrite. And again, I'm going to make it 1/2 inch equals a foot. In other words, 1 foot in my model equals 1/2 inch on the page. So I'll click OK. And then I'm going to open that guy up in Illustrator. All right, let's center this a little bit. So we're also going to go to Document Setup, Edit Artboards, 36 by 24. This doesn't matter that much, but so it's a little easier to see what we're doing here. I'll hit Control A to select all, make all the lines black. And I think all we really want here are 2 sets of lines. I'm going to copy these up because they didn't end up in my section drawing from before. Copy that. All right, so that should be good enough for the outlines for our section cut. I'm also going to make a copy of that and fill it. So I'll use the paint bucket tool or hit K on the keyboard. And just hit each of these. Okay, great. So now it's one object, just like the other lessons, and so we're just going to use that as our fill. All right, so all we should have here is 3 sets of information. One of them is our kind of poche there. One of them is the outline of the section cut, and one of them is the rest of the lines of the drawing, just later. So I'm going to go through now. Actually, I do want to just delete a couple lines here so that it's more clear. That you won't really see. So one of the reasons I'm doing a poche is so that I don't have to bother going into these walls here and like deleting those extra lines that we see when we cut through the wall. So I'm just going to ignore that stuff. All right, it's not too important. We can edit this stuff later as well. So I'm going to select these lines, make them a lighter line weight. I'm going to select these ones, make them a heavier line weight. All right, great. And so I'm just going to leave this here for now. And then you also want to open up Photoshop. So we're going to go in Photoshop, and what I'm actually going to do is make a new document. So I'm going to go Create New. Up at the top, I'll select Print. And then over on the right-hand side here, I'm going to use the dimensions of my drawing sheet. So I'll do 24 by 36. And we want the DPI to be at 300. We can just leave that as is and hit Create. Right, so there's our page, and what I'm going to do next is start to bring in these layers. And I'm just going to drag them, so I'll show you why in a minute. But if I select like just one at a time, select these layers, drag them into Photoshop, it'll come in like a little square with an X through it. I'm just going to center it on the page and hit enter. And you can see over on the right hand side it created what's called a vector smart object. I'll explain what that means in a minute, but it's going to be really helpful for editing or drawing later. So I'm just going to bring in each layer as well. Let's see if we can get this lined up properly. Press enter when I have it lined up. There we go. And then the rest of the line work. Okay, press enter. All right, so now our line work is all in there. And the nice thing about this is that it should be pretty much to scale there. So let's see, 29 minus about 6, so 23 inches, that's about the right scale. So because we scaled it when we brought it into Illustrator and then just dragged it right into Photoshop with the page sized correctly, this drawing should be 1/2 inch equals a foot. And the next step we want to do is to bring our section perspective in. I'm just going to drag that guy in as well. And what's nice about having the line work there is we can just scale this to the existing line work. And I'm actually also going to, so yeah, if we turn off the other layers, you can see here we have this kind of extra stuff from the ground plane. So we can clip that, but what I'm going to do is actually just delete it because it'll make it easier for me to, I guess I can't delete it as a smart object. So just right click on the layer and hit rasterize layer. All right, now we should be able to use the select tool, that guy there, and just delete that. That extra bit of ground. All right, and that should make it a bit easier to scale it to our line drawing. Okay, and then I'm going to select that layer one more time and hit Control T on the keyboard for transform. And I'll place it right down there. That actually looks pretty good. Let's scale it up a bit over here. Okay, looks great. So I'm going to edit my line rendering a little bit here by adding a few adjustments. First of all, in the bottom of the layers panel, that little circle with the black and white, I'm just going to hit black and white. Again, to make my image black and white. It doesn't need to be a color drawing. I'm also going to grab an exposure and just kind of bring up the contrast here. Should help us see get more definition out of the image. Again, we want to make sure that the dark areas aren't too dark, the light areas aren't too light, but the line drawing will help with some of that. That looks pretty good. Okay. Okay, yeah, so once I've done that, and I can turn the rest of my layers back on here. So those two section ones I'll ignore for the moment, but this one, just the kind of line work that outlines like most of the objects beyond the section cut. I'm going to do a little trick here to kind of make these lines read a little bit better. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all three of these layers here, the section perspective, the actual rendering, the black and white, and the exposure. And then I'm going to right click on those layers and I'm going to hit duplicate layers. Okay, so now I have a copy of all three of those layers, the image and the adjustments. Now I'm going to right click on those again. And let's see. Go go down here to where it says Merge Layers. And also hit Control E on the keyboard. Okay, and so now we have kind of this image with the adjustments flattened. And then I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and click Invert with that layer selected. And I can see the light areas became dark, excuse me, and the dark areas became light. Now I'm going to drag that up above my my line drawing for the inside of those lines there. And then I'm going to hold Alt on the keyboard, and I'm going to click in between those layers. And you can see what it's done is it's colored, basically like it's taking the color from that image and applying it to the lines. So anywhere where we have a line, it's being illustrated with the color of that inverted rendering. And what's good about that is we can, if we bump up the contrast here a little bit. Actually, I'm going to use a levels. And again, I'm holding Alt to apply it just to that layer that's adjusting, or that layer that's my inverted rendering. And then if I really crank up the contrast on that guy, you can see it'll help my lines kind of read better, pop out better. There we go. So we have them kind of inverted in the areas where we wouldn't, or where we would maybe not see them because the rendering is too dark. Okay, so that's how to get those lines to kind of read. Next thing, we'll turn on the Poche. So I'm just going to leave that Poche black, that's fine. And then finally I'll turn on that Vector Smart object, which is the outline of the section cut. And I'm going to make it white so that it kind of stands out against the background of the Poche. So I'll go down to my adjustments here again and hit solid color this time. I'm going to make a white solid fill, color fill, and then I'm going to hold Alt again and apply it to the outline there. You can see it's made our kind of section cut outline white, so it stands out against the Poche. Now, the reason that we drag those in from Illustrator and we don't want to rasterize those line drawings is because it's producing for us what's called this Vector Smart image, which means, so let's say for example I want this section cut line to be thicker. So as long as I drag it in from Illustrator, I can now click on that, double click on that little icon, that little page icon right there, and it'll automatically open this drawing up in Illustrator. And so now I could select all those lines and I could bump up their line weight, hit save, and close it, and then it'll update automatically in Photoshop. So even though we have line drawings and we're using them in Photoshop, we still have the ability to edit them in Illustrator, which is great. Okay, so there's the kind of basic setup. The next step we're going to do here will be to add Photomontage. So what I'm going to do first is model a ground plane here. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to clean up my layers just a little bit. So if I select a bunch of layers and hit Control G, or right click and hit Group Layers, Group from Layers, whatever. That just helps me kind of keep things organized. So I'll call this my Linework. This will be my rendering. Okay. And so now we want to add some more kind of information to this to kind of illustrate the context. So we'll add some images that show like what the kind of surrounding neighborhood looks like, and we'll add some vegetation, and we'll add some people to kind of illustrate the activity, you know, how some of these spaces are meant to be used and so on. So what I'm going to do first is actually model a ground plane here. So I'm going to use this selection tool, rectangle selection tool, and I'm just going to make a square that goes up to the top of my floor there. And I'll get the paint bucket tool. Oh, I actually need to make a new layer to do this. Let's see. New layer there. and then fill it. There we go. So that's going to act as our kind of baseline. The other thing I want to do right away is add a background or a sky image, basically. So I'm going to go to Google. I'm going to search for sky background, go to images, and under tools here, I'm going to choose size and go large. So we get an image that's high enough resolution to not look pixelated. It looks pretty good. Let's see. I wonder if we can even get this. All right. Make sure you're actually downloading the full high resolution version there. So I'll save as. There's it. Oh, drag that guy in as well. Okay. All right. And then I want to basically place that underneath everything else. So, well, you can see I put it underneath the rendering, which is where we want it. But we also have that kind of exposure layer that's really kind of bringing out the contrast. So I'm just going to apply those to the section perspective. Actually, you know what I could do is just flip these and then, there we go. That's a little better. Looks a little crazy, but I think it'll work fine. We may actually want to lighten that guy up so it's a little less distracting. Okay. So we have a background in place. Now what I'm going to do is try to illustrate some of the context, some of the kind of using some images from the surrounding neighborhood. So in Google Maps, I just went to where my site is for this example project. Now, I know your neighborhood is different, but just to illustrate kind of how we could go about adding some images that will give us some context here. I'm just going to use Street View images, basically. Here. And I'll tell you what, one thing I could do, well, let's just try it. So I'm going to just use like screen grabs from Google Images. So that's my site over there. So this is the adjacent building right here. And I'm going to use the snipping tool to grab a screenshot or do a print screen. But you can also just do a regular, traditional print screen. I'll just grab as much as I can because I can always crop it later. And then I'm going to save it. So I'm going to delete all these old ones here. All right. So I'll save that as site. All right. And then pick that guy in. Okay. So I'm actually just going to make a new group here, I think. Kind of getting messy. And I'm going to drop that below my rendering. Okay. You also get a black and white. Okay. Let's see here. Make this work. So, we want to kind of match the perspective angle and the scale. Scale is important, right? All right, that looks okay. All right. And then what I'm going to do is just crop that image. I'm going to get the sky out. So I'll go there and make select that layer and make a clipping mask. Then I'll use the paintbrush tool, set it to black, and just erase the sky. Again, you can hold Alt and right click on the keyboard to kind of soften or harden the brush. I'm just going to kind of fade it out so it blends into my sky background there. All right. That looks a little weird, but it should be all right. That's good enough. Then I'm also going to add like a little bit of a strip of kind of sidewalk here. So I'm just going to basically position myself. So this is that edge of my site. Obviously, I can't get a perspective. You might have actually, you guys might have images already that kind of show, you know, like show the context from the right angle you need for your drawing. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to position my camera, my kind of street view camera, right perpendicular to that sidewalk and road texture that I want. And then I'm just going to take a screen grab of those two. Oops, let's start that one more time. That's fine. Let me do it one more time. Okay. Right. Get a little bit of that. We can crop it out. All right. Save that one. And then drag it in. All right. So let's see if we can kind of make this work. I'm going to first turn it so it's roughly the right angle there. And then I'll hit Control T again to go into Transform, right click, and choose Distort. And then I'm just going to kind of basically make it match my perspective here. We're going to get a little bit of sidewalk in there, which in this case is just the dirt in between the lot and the street. All right, that looks pretty good. And then I'll do the same thing as before. I'm going to make a transparency mask, use my paintbrush tool, and just kind of blend it into the existing road texture there. Right, I'm also going to go ahead and close some things here because my computer is not happy. Okay. Right. Okay, so now we have that kind of edge setup of our site. And then I want to do the same thing for the other side here, which is that kind of alleyway. And I'm just going to kind of, I'm just going to use this kind of alleyway here. All right. About this, I guess. Let me get another angle too. I think we might want. All right. And then bring it back into Photoshop. Let's see here what makes the most sense. I think that image is going to look a little better. Right. And you know, like, I mean, we're just trying to get a sense of like what the surrounding context is like. You don't necessarily need to spend a ton of time getting it perfect. And then I'll just blend in that sky. Better like that, I think. Okay. All right. So we may want to scale these two up just a little bit. Right, that looks okay, and we can always, so yeah, I think that's good enough in terms of the context. So now I'm going to move on to vegetation, and you know, we can also use a little bit of vegetation to kind of hide some of the crazier stuff that's going on here. I also want to point out on D2L, I've put a few images of trees in. So of course, you can find trees by searching, you know, cutout tree in Google, and you know, trying to find high quality ones. You probably also want to obviously find ones that you know, fit the you know, environment, the desert flora and fauna. But if you go to our course site and go to assignments, I put this folder called P4 trees in here, and it has all these trees. They're kind of different, you know, desert-like trees. So you can just download those as well if you want. So I'm going to bring a couple of these into my scene here. All right. And I'm going to bring this stuff way up on top. So first of all, they'll have a black background. Just use the magic wand tool. Make sure you have contiguous unchecked. Click on the black background and then make a clipping mask. Right click on the clipping mask. Actually, I guess you can't do that. Hit Control I while the clipping mask is selected. Or you can go to Image Adjustments Invert on the clipping mask. Basically, it'll just make whatever is white black and whatever is black white, etc. All right. And I could darken up that black areas a little bit. Okay, and then we're going to scale this guy to the right size here. There's a couple ways we can go about this. First, I'm just going to place it. I'm going to also make a group for this guy. So I put that inside a group. I'll make it black and white. Oops, I got the wrong thing. Black and white. apply it to the whole group. All right. Kind of get into position there. And what I'm also going to do here is go back to my rendering layer, and I'm going to basically select everything that, like all the pixels inside of where my rendering is. So in order to do that, this is my rendering, this layer right here. I'm going to hold Control on the keyboard and left click on the layer. And you can see it's selected kind of everything that my rendering, everything inside of my rendering. And then I'll go back to my group here, and I'll make a adjustment or clipping mask for the group. And I can invert it there so that you know, it's only going to show things that are outside of where my kind of rendering is. This is all we really need for kind of doing these trees and stuff. Now I could also do a little quick adjustment on this tree. Okay, let's do one more. Do this guy. Right, place him in the scene. Use the magic wand tool. Make sure contiguous is unchecked. Click on the black. Now the other way you could do it here right now would be to right click and hit select inverse before you make a clipping mask, and then it'll just automatically you know, make a selection around your tree there. I'm gonna put this, right, let me just press enter to place it. So my exposure should really only be applied to that one tree. All right, and I don't know, let's put this guy like over here or something. Now you can see I have a little bit of a, oops, kind of a fine, thin line around that tree on the outside. So in order to clean that up, I want to just use the paintbrush basically and clean, like paint over the edge of where my selection is. Now, in order to make sure I'm getting the whole outline, I can hold Alt on the keyboard and left click inside of the boundary there. Oops. All right, and I'm going to level that one. Okay, and if we wanted to add shadow for this tree to kind of better integrate it into the scene, again, what we'd actually do here is use the selection we've created from our clipping mask. So instead of clicking on the image itself, we'll click on the clipping mask, hold Control, click into the clipping mask, then I'll make a new layer, put that below, and I'm just going to fill that guy with black. All right, deselect, hit Control D on the keyboard, or right click and hit deselect. And then we'll right click, Control T to transform it, right click and hit distort. And then we can, so one issue obviously is that we don't have the whole tree there. So we have to drag it back out to where we can see it first. Then I'll do the same as before, make a new layer, use the paint bucket tool to fill it, hit Control D or right click, deselect, Now I'm also going to just erase this stuff from my clipping mask. And the leftover outline stuff. All right. So let's take both of those layers and put them back. All right, and then again, I'll select that layer that I filled with just the shadow, hit distort. There we go. All right, press enter. Now there's two ways we can kind of make it lighter. Obviously we can turn down the opacity. I'm actually going to change the kind of mixing mode of this layer. I'm going to click it where it says normal up there at the top and change it to soft light. And then it'll kind of mix differently depending on what it's casting a shadow on. Right, so there we have a shadow for our tree kind of placed in the scene. All right, and last but not least, I'm going to call this my trees. And I'm also going to make a layer for foliage that's like inside of where my scene is, inside of my outdoor courtyard there. And for this, I'm actually just going to use the bush as well. I'm sorry, I'm going to use a tree to kind of make a bush. So I'll press enter to place that. And for this one, because we want it to not be clipped by the scene that by the outline of the rendering that we applied to that layer, we're going to make it a separate group for this one. And I'll probably just hit Control J to copy the black and white. Apply it to my new group. Call this my bushes. Right. So first of all, I could scale it down a bit. And I'll use W on the keyboard. Click in the black area. Right click, select inverse, make a clipping mask. So I have like a kind of row of bushes back here. And what I'm going to do is also just go in here and kind of make this and then I'm just going to cut off that bottom there. All right. So it's more like a bush, less like a tree. Okay, well, I'll click on the layer again to go back out. And then I can kind of place it right where I want it, which is in between kind of this unit and the courtyard space. I'm actually just going to make a few copies of this guy. I'm not going to worry about using a different one for each. You can right click on that layer and hit duplicate, or you can just hit Control J, copy it. And then we'll just make them all a little bit lighter. There we go. And I'm actually also gonna, well, let me put this below the line work, I think. There we go, looks a little better. We could actually go in and separate out the trees with the bushes, but I think this is good enough. Or, I'm sorry, separate out the line work from the furniture to the outlines of that glass wall, and put the bushes in between, but I think this looks good enough. So we'll just leave it like that. Okay, and the last step we're going to do here is add people. So let me apply that to that layer. To find good people, it's pretty easy. Just go to Google, search cutout people. Actually, this visualizing architecture is a good source. It'll point you towards a bunch of sites that have good, free cutout people. that you can pretty much just download. And you can kind of look through these different images and find the ones you like, the ones that are going to make sense. I would think about, like what season you're trying to represent, what kind of environment you think these people are in, whether it's hot, whether it's cold, whether they're in the sun or the shade, inside or outside, what they're doing, whether they're working or kind of relaxing, etc. So I'm just going to choose a bunch of images here and save them. Oh, I guess this one's gone. See what's a good one from here. All right, so I'm going to save a bunch of images and then I'll bring them in a second. Okay, so once I have collected enough of my scale figures here, I'm just bringing them in one by one and kind of placing them around the image to show, like what the differences are between the uses in different spaces. This one, for example, I could then make a clipping mask and kind of crop it so it fits properly. All right. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to mention is let's say we did have furniture. One thing we could do here is kind of make like a ghosted outline of that guy. So again, if we wanted to edit the line work, go back to where we created that layer. Just double click on that layer, on that smart object. And like, let's say, for example, I'm just going to make a copy of this. Oops. Oops. Let's say, for example, I wanted to kind of fill that table in so that I had I could make it look like it's sort of sitting in front of where those people are. And I've just the same thing as before, kind of use the paint bucket tool. Fill in some of those objects that should be like in front of where we're looking. Okay. Just delete this other stuff. Right click, hit expand at the top. Right click and hit ungroup. Right. And then I'll just take that set of lines and drag it in to place a new smart object. Just hit enter. I'm going to mess that up. There we go, and then I could bring it up on top of that layer that I have my people on. And color it so it's a little bit lighter. All right. Oops. And then I would bring in those lines separately. Oops. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I think that should pretty much sum it up for this tutorial. So you could print this image. I should mention actually, we really don't want you guys printing drawings that have large areas that are just pure black, because it actually breaks the printers. So what I would actually do here is just make that, gosh, what layer is that? There we go. Make that ground kind of a lighter color. So it can be gray, or even dark gray, but you don't want it to be pure black, because that'll actually break printers and then no one can use them. So the last comment would be to just make a kind of lighter Poche ground plane there. And then yeah, your image should be ready, so you can save it. You can export to or save it as a PDF, or print it to a PDF and print it and turn it in and everything like that. All right, and I'm gonna sign off.